Vampires. Vampires are great. They're creepy, they're sexy, they're super strong, they're super smart, and best of all, they're everywhere. Classical vampires like Carmilla and Dracula are stand-ins for corrupt nobles who suck the literal lifeblood from the common people in their care. The Cullens in Twilight are an eternal found family, a super glamorous, really dangerous club that Bella wants desperately to join. In the anime Vampire Knight, the powers and limitations of the vampire bloodlines and the caste system they enforce form a perfect parallel to the way that the anime approaches relationships on a personal level. Blood, as a stand-in for family, both unites and divides. And maybe most importantly, vampires are an intrinsic part of every single RPG that I have ever run. If I've been your dungeon master or game master, I'm talking to you now. Can you think of a single game that I ran that hasn't had a vampire in it? If so, I have some news for you. It did have a vampire in it. They were a minor character or a side character, perhaps. Maybe we didn't get that far, but I guarantee you, there was a vampire. So vampires have been tragic immortals, demons from hell, misunderstood dorks who can't express themselves, familial metaphors, dominatrixes, masterminds, and staple members of countless monster girl harems. This demonstrates how broad and versatile the vampire is. Vampires have never represented just one thing, and thus, vampire media is open to endless interpretation. But as you've probably guessed from the title of this video, this is not a general unpacking of vampire fiction and its history. This is a discussion of the 2019 Kotoyama manga, Call of the Night. Now, Call of the Night is a story that holds a special place in my heart. It's silly. It jumps from slice-of-life, lighthearted antics to high-stakes, life-or-death drama. And like many pieces of vampire fiction, it really made me think. Now that's right, friends. This is not an A&V. Tonight, we'll be discussing Call of the Night. Before we start, there will be spoilers in this video for the first season of the Call of the Night anime and for the first 10 volumes of the manga. I also want to admit something. I believe that just like there are a lot of interpretations of the vampire as a monster, there are a lot of ways to interpret any piece of media. Call of the Night is no exception. For that reason, I'm going to be breaking this video into 4 sections, each of which is a different lens through which this story, its vampires, and its message can be seen. There are a lot of other interesting interpretations, and if you have one, then I would love to hear about it down in the comments. Also, someone in my first video's comment section mentioned that I look like this character from What We Do in the Shadows. Thank you. That brought a smile to my face. Some of my fondest memories as a kid growing up in a small town were of sleepovers at a certain friend's house. My parents cared a lot about my health, so they made sure I got to bed at a reasonable time. At sleepovers, however, all bets were off. I could stay up until the sun rose playing video games, eating pizza, and drinking soda with friends. The night I remember most clearly, however, we did something different. We went out on the town. You see, my friend's mother owned a bar, and that bar was in our city's meager downtown. That meant that the 5 of us got to walk 12 blocks about, unsupervised through the darkness, our way lit by ancient streetlights, the endless heavens lit up with the kind of light show that I saw every night those days in the Midwest. It's the kind of light show that I never see now that I live in the city. Watching the first episode of Call of the Night, the colors, the music, and the impossibly starry sky reminded me what it was like to be a kid, strolling fearlessly into the welcoming dark. When you're young, the night is an adventure. And Ko Yamari is young. We don't actually see his home life in the first 10 volumes of the manga, nor do we see his school life, although that's mostly because he no longer attends school. But we do see the night. For Ko, an academically gifted 14-year-old, the night is a time when nothing is expected of him. For someone who has simultaneously lost the ability to sleep and lost interest in every facet of his life, he almost doesn't have anything else to do. For Ko, the night is a world that asks nothing from him. He's alone in that world, which makes him the most important person in the world by default. But as Ko soon learns, he isn't really alone in the night. The night, you see, is a transformational space, and that transformation applies to a lot of characters. These different characters have different personalities and different motivations, but they have one thing in common. They all venture into the night, and out of the night, and home before. But transformational spaces like the night in Call of the Night have existed in media for a while. Take one of my favorite examples, The Woods from the musical Into the Woods. Call of the Night, Into the Woods, there's a tendency to use that name of that transformational space as part of the title. Anyway, in Into the Woods, the characters each go into the woods to get something that they desire. Whether it's money, a child, romance, or a gift from a deceased mother. Each of the characters goes into the woods because there is something that they cannot get in their daily lives. Something they can't get outside the woods. But, of course, each of those somethings is different. The characters go into this same space, but that space fills that universal role of a place that you can find what you truly desire. And since each character desires something different, that means that the woods means something different to each character. Similarly, in Call of the Night might mean freedom and solitude for Ko, but his classmate Akira experiences it differently. Like Ko, Akira escapes into the night, but while Ko stays up late, unable to sleep, Akira wakes up early, desperate to get out of a toxic household. You could almost say that Ko meets Akira again late at night, while Akira finds Ko in the early morning. The time on the clock is the same for them both, but their paths are going opposite directions. For Ko, the day is ending. His marvelous night of freedom is coming to a close. For Akira, the day is beginning, and she's making her way to school to throw herself into her studies. Ko, unable to connect with or place value on the things that are expected of him, is drifting, a boy in denial. Akira simply trades one set of obligations for another. But of course, Ko and Akira are not vampires. They are humans. For the vampires in the story, the night is something else entirely. The vampires are still individuals, of course. I'll talk about a few of these individual vampires a bit as we go on, but they share a common relationship with the night, at least in broad strokes. We're never explicitly told that vampires have any weakness to sunlight. To our knowledge, they don't burn, tan, or sparkle. So while seeking out the night seems natural to them, it still seems like they have a choice. But that choice is obvious, because a vampire is a person who fully embraces the transformative power of the night. As I mentioned before, every piece of vampire fiction gives vampires a different meaning, and this meaning is always tied up in what a vampire doesn't have that a human does. Is that vampire's skin cold and hard like stone? Are they cut off from divine grace? Well, in the case of Call of the Night, vampires lose something much less tangible, their connections. This too is symbolized perfectly in the night. The night is darkness, anonymity. As vampires live their eternal lives, they gradually lose their memories, eventually forgetting everything about their human lives. Their only weaknesses are their possessions, items that bring forth a light in the darkness, illuminating who they were and scattering the selves that they have become, now mere darkness. It's not a mistake that when we first see a vampire die, it happens at dawn. He's given a ring that mattered tremendously to him as a human, and as the sun illuminates the world, the vampire dissipates. The transformation is broken. So, for a vampire, what does this transformation entail? What is its logical endpoint? While each vampire goes about this in a different way, their primary use for the night is, well, feeding. Vampires drink blood. It's the one thing every piece of vampire fiction agrees upon. The symbolism of drinking blood will come up a few more times in this video, so for now, I'll generalize and say that blood drinking is a fundamentally social act in the context of Call of the Night. So until we revisit this, it's safe to say that vampires truly embody the transformation of the night. The night is when they live, and it is completely comfortable to them. And then we have Nazuna. Nazuna does the whole social drinking thing, but she minimizes the social element as much as she can. Nazuna plays the part of a cuddle buddy, inviting her donors into her apartment, and then waiting until they fall asleep to begin drinking. This is so she can keep up her lifestyle of gaming and lounging around all night, using cuddling and massaging to pay the bills, and using the blood she drinks to sustain herself. It's a contradiction. A life that is simultaneously self-indulgent and bare minimum. In short, she takes the night completely for granted, barely engaging with it. It's not a coincidence at the beginning of the story that Nazuna, The vampire who spends the least time really experiencing the night outside of her small apartment is also the vampire who is the most distant from her social group of fellow vampires. Nazana's social isolation and lackadaisical lifestyle don't make her less of a vampire, though. In fact, depending on how you look at the vampires, it may almost make her the most vampire of all. As beings with supernaturally long lives, the vampires in Call of the Night have an interesting relationship with age, and this manifests in two ways. First, this long life manifests in a greater degree of confidence and composure. It's this composure that makes Ko's first encounter with the full cast of vampires so intimidating. While a child engages with the world without understanding, an adult can navigate through that same world effortlessly. The vampires are more experienced. They understand how humans think, how conversations unfold. They have places to live and places to go, whereas Ko walks through the night blind until he meets Nazana. In these respects, the vampires project maturity. But secondly, these vampires can also project profound immaturity. As mentioned before, Nazana is the most obvious example. She uses sexual humor to try and show how adult she is, but she's actually the most reserved and embarrassed when it comes to talking about relationships and romantic feelings. This is a fairly common character trope that takes on a new meaning in the context of our vampires. As a result, relationships may be the place that this interesting push and pull of maturity versus immaturity can be seen most clearly. Take Ciri, the blonde Gyaru vampire. She's a vampire who, according to Nazana, doesn't hang out with humans except to feed. And while she's incredibly good at finding prey, she struggles with what comes next. Her victims become obsessive, and her stock response to this problem is fairly surface level.
Like I said, I can just kill them if it gets too messy.
You can't do that!
Why not? It's only natural for humans to get killed by vampires.
Vampires are so arrogant! I'm sure sometimes you have to, but that guy isn't one of them!
But mere minutes later, we learn something that turns our understanding of Ciri on its head. Ciri hasn't killed anyone, not once, and that kind of makes sense. Vampires are more powerful than humans, and as long as they're careful who they tell they're vampires, then most situations probably won't escalate to the point that murder is the only way out. After all, when you're trying to keep your existence a secret, a string of murders probably isn't the best way to do it. This even gets explicitly stated in Volume 10. A murder that can be traced back to the vampires is the most dangerous thing for the vampires and their rule over the night. This moment shows some impulsiveness, maybe even immaturity on Ciri's part, but it's also a moment of weakness. But I'll save that discussion for Section 3. Suffice to say for now, there are several ways we can contextualize Ciri's behavior, but for our purposes here, she benefits from the presumption of maturity that the vampires can claim, and she also has aspects of herself that are immature. Ways she behaves and kinds of relationships that she simply can't navigate that show that while her apparently endless life has strengthened her in many ways, it has also left gaps in her development. But it wouldn't be possible to communicate this theme clearly if we didn't have someone to compare to our vampires. And that's where Ko comes in. It may be the case that the vampires look simultaneously so mature and occasionally so immature because we see them through the eyes of Ko, someone who is immature in some ways but is also still human, and thus doesn't necessarily share the vampire's particular immature tendencies. He hasn't had as many years for the gaps in his maturity to expand, and he doesn't have to switch between seeing humans as sources of nourishment and seeing them as people. But legally speaking, he's still a minor, and this causes problems for him. This is a very practical kind of maturity that the vampires can claim, but Ko cannot, being considered an adult in the eyes of the law. And this weakness isn't obvious until it's used against him by Anko, the vampire hunting detective. In one scene, Anko threatens to expose Ko for working at night while underage, and in another, she calls the police to tell them about an unattended minor wandering around at night. By framing the vampires as a comment on maturity, it becomes obvious that vampires, like adults, enjoy privileges that children cannot. They must abide by restrictions specific to their lifestyle, but most importantly, they don't necessarily have everything figured out. They're learning as they go, learning about themselves, rediscovering their old memories, using group problem-solving to navigate uncharted waters, such as their decision not to kill Ko, and learning about their emotions and relationships, as with Ciri. But I can't end this section without one final note on the vampire hunting detective I mentioned a minute ago. Anko really is a special case. Like Ko, Anko used to think vampires were cool, but then her father turned into a vampire, murdered her mother, and was in turn killed by Anko. Since then, she has sought to kill vampires as a rebuttal to the immaturity of the man who should have protected her, and as a sort of revenge for her lost family and the forced end to her childhood. And because of this complicated relationship with maturity, Anko herself may be even more immature than the vampires she's hunting. She doesn't make her decisions based on the law, by her own admission. And her master plan in Volume 9 starts out playful, even though its intended endpoint is as destructive to her as it is to the vampires in the story. This might be a good time to mention that nothing I say here is intended to make light of Anko. Her backstory is genuinely tragic, and it's truly painful to see how little meaning there is left in her life except in killing vampires. And so on that sobering note, I'd like to address Anko's final contribution to the theme of maturity, the way she hits on Ko. Here are a few snippets from their first interaction.
I swear I wasn't trying to hit on you or anything like that. It was purely for business.
Aw, that's too bad.
What?
You had me all excited for a minute. A young person like you making a move on me?
I'm really
Damn.
sorry, but,
I've been so lonely lately. If you hear anything about Akun, get in touch. And hey, you might as well hit on me properly next time, young man. If you don't mind older women, that is.
As you can see, Anko assumes, or playfully suggests, that Ko reached out to her to pick her up, then tells him that he's welcome to actually flirt with her in the future. I see 3 levels of interpretation here. The first level is to state the obvious. This is inappropriate and even a bit uncomfortable. Ko is underage, and Anko knows this. She's threatened to use this against him, in fact. But on a second, more meta level of interpretation, we see that Anko fits into the broader schema of the cool older sister archetype, an archetype that she shares with some of the vampires, including Nico. This archetype has appeared in many anime, with the corresponding age gaps ranging from negligible to extreme, and with their flirty behavior being presented as everything from harmless fun to a cry for help. But on a third, more sympathetic level, Anko's flirting is our first hint at who our detective really is. She's someone who was never allowed to grow up properly. A woman whose development hit a brick wall when she was in her final year of high school, and who hasn't been able to move forward for an entire decade. Anko lost the first decade of her adult life, a decade where most of us are able to transition gradually into adulthood with the help of our families, but she does get a new lease on life after her master plan fails. I would like to end this section with Anko's own words, from the desperate moment right before she embraces that new lease on life.
I've spent the past 10 years taking out the anger of my father being taken from me. But I'm tired now. All that's left is an empty shell with nothing I can build on. Just a boring old woman. Yamori-kun, I've made many mistakes in my life. I didn't get a single thing I wanted. Please, please, you must not end up like me.
But of course, that's only one reading. By another interpretation, vampires represent the social butterfly, a person who can fit comfortably into every social situation. I'd like to emphasize the word can in that definition, though. While most of the vampires in Call of the Night spend the night socializing, Nazuna does not. This serves a few purposes. Firstly, it establishes that vampires are beings who value interpersonal connections, even if those connections are often self-serving when they involve humans. Our vampires have a social structure, and by existing on the outskirts of that structure, Nazuna gives us some insight into it. But secondly, it allows us to see that even the least sociable vampire in this story is incredibly socially adept. There are several scenes that highlight this. We can see Nazuna's social prowess in the scene where Nazuna befriends the 3 drunk strangers whom Ko might otherwise have avoided. We also see it at the pool party, where Nazuna manages to attract the attention of several men and plays along easily with their flirting until Ko takes the hint and steps in. The message is clear. Nazuna usually doesn't choose to put herself into social situations, but when she does, she's able to navigate them with ease. It almost goes without saying, then, that the rest of the vampires are even more socially adept. In fact, their vampirism is the metaphor for their approach to relationships. In literal terms, they gain sustenance from the blood of others. In metaphorical terms, they are empowered by the social energy they draw from these people. This overpowering social prowess is, again, shown clearly when Ko is brought before the rest of the vampires, but it's also very visible in the one-off scenes that focus on some of the different characters. Midori takes pride in her ability to, quote-unquote, demolish the defenses of her maid cafe patrons. Nico works as a teacher, a job which requires a lot of social poise, and uses her platform to help her students make the most out of their lives. And Hatsuka seems to have attracted a small cult. This is the sort of person that Ko wants to be. In fact, the reason he disappeared into the night in the first place was because during the day, he was bad at something that vampires are exceptionally good at: relationships, and specifically, romantic relationships. After turning down a classmate's romantic confession and being berated for making her cry, Ko loses interest in his daily life and in his education, but he's just as quickly pulled into the vampire's world. The thing is, he can't become a vampire. According to Call of the Night, the requirements to become a vampire are that you have to fall in love with a vampire, and then that vampire has to drink your blood. But the problem is, Ko can't fall in love. The same problem that cut him off from daytime living has made it impossible, at least for now, to become his ideal self. Romance never made sense to him, so he turned down his classmate. Romance never made sense to him, so he can't fall in love with Nazuna, and can't become a vampire. And I don't think Ko realizes what it is that's so compelling about vampires himself, at least not at first. From his limited perspective in Episode 1, having only met Nazuna, he may not have seen the vampire experience in its full context. What he did know was that a vampire seemingly isn't bound by day-to-day rules. A vampire doesn't attend school. A vampire is well-liked, beautiful, a ruler of the night. And like so many of us when we encounter social butterflies, Ko wanted to be like them, like her. And he wanted this even without fully understanding what a vampire was, because, by his own admission, he had nothing else. At the moment, Ko isn't very vampire-like. If the vampires in this story represent the social ideal, effortless lovers, partiers, and professionals, then at the core, this isn't who Ko is. I think Ko's position is relatable for many of us. It's easy to see someone navigate situations you have difficulty with, and think of them as superhuman, even intimidating. And I think in those situations, we can get some mileage out of the lesson that Ko is learning in this manga. The first step to becoming your best self is to understand the qualities that you want to embody. And sometimes that can mean challenging things that are fundamental to your understanding of the world and your understanding of who you are. Even that first step can be incredibly challenging. But you may have noticed that I held back a bit in that last section, and there's a reason for that. After all, the vampire isn't just a social adept. The vampire may in fact represent something even more specific. Allow me to explain. One detail I held back on that can help distinguish between this point and my last one is the fact that while Ko uses the night to escape people as much as anything else, while he doesn't understand romance, and while he's awkward in some situations where Nazuna excels, he actually performs well socially in some situations where Nazuna doesn't. Take this scene from the manga, where Nazuna and Ko visit Nico's classroom.
Nanakusa-san, please introduce yourself.
I'm Nanakusa Nazuna. I like alcohol and gaming. What else can I say? I'm a vampire.
Thank you, Nanakusa-san. Let's have a little talk afterwards. You're next, Yamori-kun.
Nice to meet you. My name is Yamori Ko, and I will be a part of this class starting today. I'm not sure I'll be able to keep up with the curriculum, but I'd like to think of it as a life experience if I can learn anything at all. Nice to meet you all.
Gross.
Huh.
Aren't you a bit too mentally weak?
Well, even if I were to mingle with them, I'm a vampire. Seeing Yamori-kun, who's a human, surpassing me in popularity is a bit... I'm not sure how to feel about it.
What's interesting is that this is a rare scene in which Nazuna is jealous of Ko's ability to turn on the charm. The fact of the matter is, Ko isn't always awkward. He's a high-achieving student, and he's actually incredibly competent at presenting himself in this way. While I implied that the vampires were all super socially competent in the previous section, here I'll be doing something a little different, breaking down social competency into domains. Ko's domain, the area where he excels socially, is in the classroom. He's humble, polite, pragmatic, and clever. So to distinguish our vampires from a human character like Ko, who has a lot of social competency in his own area, we have to ask what area of social competency corresponds to the vampires. That's right, we've finally gotten to the title of this video. The vampires, at least the main cast of Call of the Night, fall into the domain of girl boss. So let me start by acknowledging the obvious. Call of the Night does feature some male vampires. These vampires include Midori's otaku friend, Seri's stalker, the teacher who's killed by Anko, and Anko's father. But you might have noticed something interesting in these descriptions. They all exist relative to a main character. Lovegreen and Aki, the otaku and the stalker, respectively, exist almost exclusively to play off Midori and Seri. The teacher and Anko's father, meanwhile, are not recurring characters. They exist as cautionary tales to show how frightening vampires can be, then they are both killed by Anko. Because these characters aren't front and center like the main clique of vampires we see, not everything I say here will apply to them. This isn't a strict definition of the literal traits of all vampires in the story, so much as it's an exploration of its themes. And I think it's less interesting to analyze those themes by asking what kinds of vampires are allowed to exist in this world, and more interesting to ask what kinds of vampires this story chooses to focus on. So then, why use the word girl boss? Well, first, it's a fun word to describe what I'm talking about here. But as we get into this section, I'd like to put a little more explanation behind that word. When I say the main cast of vampires in Call of the Night are girl bosses, I'm describing a certain kind of performative femininity. A femininity characterized by strength, confidence, and charisma. And this identity really shapes how the world treats them, and how they engage with the world. This vampire girl boss identity has some real advantages in a lot of social situations, and it affords the vampires some privileges that others do not have access to. But as we'll see, it also introduces some disadvantages that echo in the lived experiences of real people. To highlight some of these advantages and disadvantages, I'll be drilling down on 3 of Call of the Night's vampires: Hatsuka, Midori, and Seri. I think starting with Hatsuka is appropriate here, since Hatsuka is the character who has made the most conscious choice to embrace his girl power. You see, Hatsuka presents as female, but identifies as male. Ko asks this in as many words, and Hatsuka confirms it.
You're a guy?
Yeah, that's right.
Then later in the scene, when Ko asks why Haka dresses as a girl, he gives this response.
How come you dress like a girl anyway?
It's obviously because I look good this way. I mean, for whatever reason, both men and women are attracted to me when I dress like this.
I tend to assume that people either like what they do or someone's making them do it.
Yamari, I do it because I enjoy the way I look.
Hatsuka is interesting here because I think he shows why this performative femininity, this girl boss persona, is worth taking on. It draws people in, people from whom he can extract energy. That energy is literal blood, which keeps him alive and powerful, but it also takes the form of love and attention that he's showered with whenever he walks through the door of his own apartment. If Hatsuka's followers are cult-like, then it is a direct result of Hatsuka acting the part of the girl boss. Such people tend to attract friends and supporters, causing social groups to spring up around them. Sort of a Haruhi Suzumiya phenomenon, if you will. And I don't think the fact that Haka does this for himself and not for other people is a coincidence either. A person in his position isn't some product to be consumed. They're a person, and their needs and wants come first. This social group has formed around Hatsuka because he gets energy from that group. But in turn, his group draws value from simply being near him and being of use to him. They value his attention and quality time, and just having him as a master is a value add in their lives. What Hatsuka reveals about a vampire through the lens of a girl boss, then, is that a vampire/girl boss is someone whose needs are prioritized by those around them as a matter of course. The vampire/girl boss attracts people who meet those needs, then gives back value by being there and being who they are. But while Haka's situation is relatively uncomplicated, our next 2 examples touch on both the positives and the negatives of the girl boss role. Take Midori, a busy vampire girl who uses a simple maid outfit to lure men into her clutches. Those aren't my words, by the way. I lifted that description from chapter 31 of the manga. Midori notes that in a maid cafe, even mortal girls become goddesses, and when she enlists Nazuna as a temporary worker at the cafe, her rationale is that she only knows vampires, so she wants someone who's attractive, but not too attractive, because she doesn't want them stealing the tastiest men, quote unquote. Midori's situation is perfect for a vampire, but problems arise when peeping Tom photos of Midori's coworker Arisa, the cafe's second most popular maid, appear online. This alone would have been a negative enough side effect of becoming a mortal goddess to the cafe's patrons, but then something interesting happens. Ko and Nazuna do some sleuthing, only for Ko to come to the conclusion that the culprit is Arisa herself. Arisa has been using her phone's camera to take timed photos of herself, with the damning piece of evidence being that the pictures were all too professional, too flattering. She posted the pictures online for attention because she was jealous of Midori, the inhumanly attractive maid who swooped in and stole her role as the most popular maid. This is a side effect of being the girl boss TM, an effect that it has on the women around you. This problem doesn't affect the vampire clique itself, since each of the vampires can splinter off and act as the queen bee of her own satellite group. But for the members of Midori's satellite group, the Maid Cafe, a completely natural sort of competition starts to crop up. For someone who's used to being the most accomplished, most attractive, most talented person in her ecosystem, a more successful stranger is the greatest threat to one's role and self-image. This is exactly why Arisa acts as she does. Jealousy and a desire to be admired drive Arisa because she might not be a vampire, but she is a girl boss. Competition and resentment are sadly common when multiple people in a social group try to hold this top spot at the same time. But it's exactly this understanding, the understanding that this sort of competition is completely understandable and common, that Call of the Night uses to vindicate Arisa. She's never condemned for lying or manipulation. In fact, Midori embraces her and acknowledges her insecurities and her needs. After all, as she puts it, all of the girls working at this cafe desire attention, so they've converged on this place where people will pay them money for the privilege of giving them that attention. So while Arisa's first impulse was to quit in shame, she instead keeps working as a maid after talking to Midori. She even takes photos of herself still, on occasion, but now they're selfies, pictures taken without deception and with the explicit purpose of self-promotion. And now for our final example, we return to Seri. Seri's situation is similar to the one we just discussed in that it involves a stalker, but unlike the stalker who took photos of Arisa, Seri's stalker is very real. Earlier in this video, I described Seri as a Gyaru, and this is where that descriptor really comes into play. Seri's appearance, with her blonde hair, short skirt, and baggy sweater, fits the bill, and so too does her behavior. Members of the Gyaru subculture are known to love drinking, flirting, and just generally having fun in casual settings. This describes Seri to a T. In fact, I would say that the behaviors that make Seri a great Gyaru are the same traits that make her a great vampire, at least by this series' standards. A great friend of mine who goes by the Logi online once said, "In a world where muted colors, conformity, and quiet acceptance are the gender norms and expectations for women, Gyarus are the face of rejecting the patriarchy." These aren't my words, but I agree with them wholeheartedly. Perhaps the Gyaru trait that applies most perfectly to Seri is that Gyarus tend not to care about power structures or the expectations of others. Of the vampires we've seen, Seri has been the most willing to engage in violent acts on screen, attacking Aki, fighting Nazuna, and tackling Ko, showing maybe the least discretion in this regard. And similar to Hatsuka, who is called Master by men and women alike, and Midori, who takes advantage of the maid cafe setting to be treated as a goddess, Seri very clearly sees humans, particularly the men she preys upon, as beneath her. Humans are only good for offspring or food, she says herself. For Seri, hanging out with a guy is a fun way to pass the time, and yet there's an invisible boundary there that she doesn't explicitly state, but which is probably not surprising from a Gyaru. After killing some time and having some fun, she'll move on to someone else and some other experience. That's when the guys get clingy, and they make the whole girl boss experience a lot less fun for Seri. But Aki, the stalker in question, isn't just a point on the trend line of Seri's flings gone wrong. He's a person. And there's a reason that he was the last straw for Seri, tipping the scales toward murder. See, Aki was different from all the others in that Seri didn't approach him for romance. She approached him as a potential friend. But while the two saw each other as friends, Seri engaged with him like she engages with every boy, by teasing and flirting. And so, like many before him, Aki fell in love. And then, he became obsessed. But I think this is a good moment to bring the video down to reality for just a second. I have a number of friends that I consider to be girl bosses, at least by the definitions that we've laid out here. Some of those friends, like Haka, will form social groups around themselves, like Midori will become the standard that other people will try to measure up to, and, like Seri, will befriend men and boys in their lives, only to then be pestered with unwanted romantic advances. At least one of the people that I'm talking about here is actually a voice on this video, and so I wanted to take the chance and make a shameless plug. All of the folks who worked on this are absolutely wonderful, capable, and charismatic people. If you have the chance, please check out the credits, check out the video description, and give some of their other content a watch or a look. I promise you, you will get to see the sort of charisma that I've been talking about in this section. But when it comes down to it, there are two sides to this problem for Seri and for others like her. One is the fact that, for good and ill, Seri doesn't turn on or off her personality traits. She is who she is, and her style of communication is friendly, teasing, and flirtatious. This makes it easy for Aki to see a possible romantic relationship. Seri herself acknowledges that she reaches across the boundary of friendship into romance without even meaning to.
I don't know how to communicate like an ordinary friend would. I unconsciously act in a way to make people fall for me. I react with thoughts like, if I make a move now, he'll fall in love with me for sure. I'm tired of that.
But the other side to the problem comes from Aki, and others like him that Seri has encountered. Aki follows up on his budding romantic feelings with unsolicited advances, with stalking, spamming, and a refusal to let the relationship remain within the boundaries that Seri has explicitly set. This side of the problem is one of entitlement to Seri's time and attention. Flirting is not a promise of future affection. And let's be clear, it's Aki's extreme escalation in behavior that causes their friendship to become contentious. And it's what pushes Seri to murder. This murderous intent is another escalation, this one from Seri's side. As this struggle reaches its conclusion, Seri confronts Aki in an alleyway and confesses that she's a vampire. Now Aki knows about the existence of vampires, and by their own rules, he can't leave this situation as a human. She can either turn Aki into a vampire, or she can kill him. And in the end, Seri chooses to turn Aki into a vampire. There are three perspectives that are given on this. First, in the middle of the scene, Code decides that Seri has fallen in love with Aki as well, which is why she's holding back from killing him in this final moment. Then we hear Seri tell him she wants to keep being friends. And then, a volume later, Aki himself says that if Ko hadn't been there, he and Seri would have broken up. The sum total here is that Seri and Aki definitely remained friends. And there's a romantic dimension to their relationship, at least from Aki's perspective. And since Ko's observation is framed as a moment of insight, I think we can take Aki's perspective seriously. When I first finished this arc, I actually felt a little ambivalent. I wondered if the fact that Aki became a vampire and was able to continue hanging out with Seri was intended to validate the idea that Seri owed him some sort of time or affection. But as I processed that a bit further, I decided that that is not what this arc is about. For starters, Seri is not condemned for the 99% of guys that she has turned down and or not followed up with. Only Aki, the one person that she did care about personally from the start. And then on the other side, Aki has done a really good job of allowing Seri to continue to be who she is, at least as of Volume 10. He hasn't shown any indication that he would get in the way of her doing that, and then, furthermore, some of the ways that he talks, I think, are really telling. For instance, there's a bit where he's talking to Ko afterwards, and he says, if you hadn't been there, we would have broken up. Note that he says, we would have broken up, and not, Seri would have killed me. And I cannot stress this enough. There is no more perfect way to show that Aki has decided to stop sweating the small details and allow Seri to be her best self. In the end, I think the conclusion Seri comes to is one built on boundaries, on what she is comfortable with. At the start of their relationship, Seri and Aki talked with each other about what they wanted their relationship to be like. And at the time, they settled on a platonic friendship. But such a friendship was outside the bounds of what Seri was equipped to engage with as someone for whom flirting was always temporary, and platonic interactions with men were basically non-existent. And then Aki, by his own admission, crossed that boundary entirely. But at last, Aki and Seri have another conversation, establishing new boundaries for a new leg of the relationship. Aki, knowing this will alter who he is fundamentally, is comfortable being a vampire and continuing to be Seri's friend. And Seri is willing to establish new boundaries if it means they can continue to be friends. It's not much, and a lot more was probably said off-screen after that celebratory night of karaoke. But I think the arc ties Call of the Night's themes together well, and it leaves us on a hopeful note. It's a story about someone being transformed, about two people engaging with their own immaturity. It's about someone who's socially adept and someone who's becoming more socially adept. And of course, it's about a vampire navigating her role as a girl boss. With all of that being said, let's ask the question that I implied in my intro. What is Call of the Night about? Well, it's about a lot of things. Call of the Night is a story broken into arcs, each of which hone in on different elements of its larger themes. In this video, I've discussed some of those arcs as they've been relevant to the themes I've explored. I think Call of the Night is a story that's fascinated with transforming and challenging its characters, using the night as a tool and a stage to explore these characters' desires. It's also a story about growing up, conveying the push and pull between maturity and immaturity in both its human characters and its immortal vampires. One could say it's about reckoning with the fact that some people seem more charming and socially competent than we are. And then finally, it's a story that uses its characters to explore the power that comes with performing certain kinds of femininity. But most of all, Call of the Night is a charming, down-to-earth vampire story with great gags and even better characters. Like any piece of media, it's a place for us to see ourselves and our struggles. And it's a story we can endlessly explore for new insight and new meaning. So if you have not read Call of the Night, I wanted to say first, thank you so much for making it this far, genuinely. I know I've talked for a while here, and I really hope that I've said something that might inspire you to check it out. It is a lot of fun. But for those of you who have read or watched Call of the Night, I wanted to say this. I walked out into the night like the characters from this story in search of my own meaning, and I've found some things, that I think are interesting. I've spent a while talking about them. That being said, I think there are so many more lenses through which to read this kind of fun vampire story, and I would love to hear yours in the comments, so feel free. I look forward to hearing from you. But either way, I wanted to say I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and until then, good night, friends. Some of you may have realized that I didn't talk about Kiku in this video, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that I didn't want to spoil more volumes of the manga. The second was that the video had already gotten really long, and I had to cap it somewhere, but she's front of mind, and Kiku is really great. Anyway, good night for real this time, friends.